So today I have Karla Fraser, who is a global educator, international education consultant, career strategist, and the CEO and founder of Roseapple Global LLC. Karla, welcome to EdVenture.
Thank you, Ahmed. I'm glad to be here. Glad to be on adventure.
Fantastic. So my first question, obviously, I cannot move forward without asking. So where did Rose Apple Global, what's the origins of that word for your company?
So, rose apple is actually a fruit in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, my home of heritage and origin of my parents.
Oh,
So,
wow.
it's a fruit tree, and I used to climb that tree when I was a little kid and eat the rose apple fruit. Um, and Rose is actually my mother's middle name, and apples have a story behind apples in my life as a childhood. So it has like three different meanings of where the name came up for my company. So yeah.
Wow. Well, you know what they say is, names matter because you're setting the narrative for the future of your company, and it really needs to have meaning close to you. And it sounds like you put a lot of thought into that, and that's really cool.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the company, the reason for its founding, and yeah, what do you do?
So Roseapple Global started out of literally me coaching, talking to, encouraging colleagues to move abroad in higher education. In other words, come join me. Um, and it literally, I used to do this coffee tables, over coffee, conferences, talk about my experiences working abroad. And
Mhm.
then essentially, 2018, December, actually, I was at a conference and a young lady at the conference said to me, "Hey, I love the fact that you're abroad. Can you coach me? Can you help me do this?" And I said, "Sure. Let's get together, December, January, and we'll figure this all out." And so that was the birth of the company as a formality.
Mm.
I had worked with, friends or other colleagues and shared tips and advice before. But the company really has two parts. One is this expat career coaching, specifically for higher ed folks, so that they can go abroad, move abroad, work abroad in higher ed and do it well. And when I mean that, I mean the purpose of you doing it, the transition, choosing locations, being able to know that you're bringing your expertise to whatever location you choose, east, west, north, south, global south, global
Absolutely.
north,
Yeah.
whatever it may be. But what is important is the cultural context in which you leave your expertise. And so you got to merge those two. And so, really talking to folks about that. So, I help folks through that process of starting their journey, understanding their purpose, looking at geography. Everyone comes with a list, and I'm like, great, let's talk about the list that you don't have yet. Let's talk about your resume, your cover letter, those pieces that you need to do this search well. Let's talk about negotiation and transition and the importance of you being there, which is you're there to give, share your expertise, but you're also there to learn. And especially for those who want to come back into their home country, be it US, Canada, Europe, South America, after they've done their time abroad, is you're bringing back information, knowledge that you've gained to a new home institution that can help those students that you're now working with. So that's the first part, the expat coaching part of the company.
Well, it's interesting, and that's thank you, because what I find so often, especially in education, that in higher ed education in particular, especially professionals, that they end up embodying a lot of different skills, especially with international experience. But when you get them back, or when you ask them to find ways to convey that, they often undervalue the experience that they've had in terms of transferring that onto a resume or an interview or a conversation where that value can end up providing them with opportunity.
Very true. And I do talk to folks about, when you get back, how can that impact an institution? Some people want to come back, some people don't. But yeah,
That's right.
and yeah. So then, yeah, the second part of my company is the consultant side.
Mm-hmm.
And so my goal and aspiration is to consult for institutions globally. And that includes back at home in the United States, in the area of student affairs in particular. So working around helping institutions understand their international students, helping, student development concepts for global institutions who are seeking to have a student-centered perspective of their students, help develop workforce development skills, or soft skills is another way we call them, or those critical thinking, problem solving types things that is a North American lens, particularly US lens, because those philosophies of student affairs and student development had their birth in the United States. And so they're not global concepts. However, they're becoming more global. And so my goal is to be able to consult with universities or academic organizations that are seeking to incorporate those global principles into their education system,
Wow.
and work with those organizations.
That's great. So, it's interesting that, first of all, you have tons of international experience, and we're going to take a deep dive in that in a moment, because I just found it to be incredible, your background. But, what I find interesting is that right now, global education appears to be growing, but it's kind of a known factor, or more of a known factor in the K-12 world. However, you seldom find individuals who really know about the international and global market when it comes to higher ed. What are the type of jobs and opportunities that you present and others are pursuing in global higher education? Where's the need?
So that is very true. The K through 12 space has been well developed, and the higher ed space is one-off or emergent, I would say. The need is really in one, innovation. Two, it's the technology spaces, the teaching pedagogy. You've always had faculty that could go abroad and teach. That is still needed, because that knowledge, I don't want to say knowledge transfer, but that knowledge sharing is still needed in the academic side. The administrator side is what most people don't know, which is what I've done for 10 plus years abroad, is been a student affairs administrator. And so that administration is a side that folks can explore, whether that's academic administration or student services, student affairs administration. And so that's where your soft skills, workforce development skills come in, to be able to teach that, develop those areas from student housing to student organizations, to leadership development, to entrepreneurship hubs. It's that side of the house that is needed. It needs to be cracked open, to use that kind of terminology. And institutions abroad, there are institutions out there that are doing some of this, but I think if more institutions would do, I think it would develop their institutions, their education system, and their students and their fellow citizens quicker. So I think that's the place where I think growth can really happen. I tend to be an anomaly, someone who's been in student affairs abroad for 10 years consecutively. I've had some other colleagues and we're in a small circle. We tend to know each other. that have done this, but it's not the commonplace. You find a faculty member easier than you'd find a student affairs practitioner.
So is there a market for this? I mean, how are student affair practitioners who want to do something globally? I mean, what usually is their first step to finding those opportunities? How do they end up finding people like you, or even finding, let's just say, kind of recruitment platforms or pathways to get there?
Okay. Yeah, so unlike the K through 12 sector that have recruiters and placement agencies and services that help them navigate in the system, higher ed doesn't have that. It's more traditional. It's using your network and knowing folks within the international higher ed space, whether it's faculty or student services, student affairs, to navigate some of what's happening on the ground. It is finding someone like me that is coaching folks and do all the digging for you to be able to send you and navigate you to the places you choose or want to live. Some of it, folks just do it on their own, by the luck of the draw. It's the Google search, it's the applications. A lot of the applications, the positions are still very much the old-fashioned way. You're going on to Google and you're searching, you're looking in LinkedIn, you're looking in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, you're looking at the regional, local search areas, such as in Middle East, it's BOT, or it's, oh my gosh, I can't think of the one in Asia right now. My brain just died. But it's using those local streams, Job Street. Thank you. It's using those local streams to find the opportunities that are out there, and then navigating them. So it's still very much, it's not streamlined at all. The only streamlined positions that you can possibly find are pretty much your senior leadership, president, provost, which sometimes the schools will use a search firm to hire and go after their presidents, their provosts, their VPs, and then you go through that search firm funnel. But if you want to be an entry level to mid level, it's the old fashioned way.
So it sounds like there is a very much a reason to connect with Roseapple Global then, because it sounds like that you really do are a great connector, to those type of opportunities. Now, your background is incredible. I spoke a little bit earlier about your journey into the global education space and your interest specifically around the changing nature of higher ed in developing countries. So can you just quickly provide what's been your career journey and how did it end up in this very unique space that I have an interest in too, is on the changing nature of higher ed in kind of the global space.
Sure. So I went to school. So it really started out with, I went to school in Illinois for high school, but then I went to North Dakota for my undergraduate. I went to Ohio for my master's, and then worked in the US at a variety of schools, crisscrossing the country. Mostly, I did a little bit in the West, mostly the Midwest. Worked in student affairs. So at large schools, small schools, private schools, public schools. My goal long term was to be a director of Women's Life. And so I was really trying to get all the experiences. And I was doing it on my own terms, not in the way that everyone thought you should do it, which is you get to a school, you stay there, you climb the ropes, you keep going, and then you eventually become the director. That was not Karla's path. Karla's path was, if you couldn't give me a promotion within 2 to 3 years, I was moving on to the next institution to get a promotion and get the skills I needed to become a director. So people would always say, you're damaging your career moving around this much. I said, no, I'm gaining the skills I need to be a director when I sit at the table as a director. But you know, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, no one believed that. That is common now. It's
Yeah.
commonplace that people move around now. I was doing this 15 years ago, and everyone's like, no, don't do that. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to go
Yeah,
down that path.
and plus the traditional way is, let's be frank with this, it's boring anyway because it only kind of perpetuates the status quo model of higher ed. And I think
Right.
when you're able to take those nonlinear routes, you know, you're bringing in different experiences that that play into a different type of lens, a different a different way and willingness to engage the campus community as well as the broader community that you're seeking to serve, the learners.
Very true. And so having, you know, having the experience of small private, large public, all these things, being on the East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, and then, you know, when I went to a campus, I brought all that with me. And I think it was a challenge for some institutions and some staffs. But then I continued, and then 2007 happened, and I had applied for a position, forgotten about it in the Middle East, and I got a 3 a.m. call. This says, Ms. Fraser, you applied for this job. And I'm like, where? What? I'm asleep. Can you call me back? And they did. And so
Mm-hmm.
I ended up on an interview and ended up taking my first international position in the UAE right now, 15 years ago.
Wow.
Uh,
Wow.
and so worked in the UAE while the UAE was under construction. So the things you see now, I actually watch a lot of that get built. The
Wow. That's
Dubai of
incredible.
today and the Abu Dhabi of today, I watch that built. I watch those roads, highways, buildings. You know, the world's tallest building was under construction when I lived there.
Well,
Um,
it is interesting now because if you close your eyes for a moment, you could probably see the development double in those countries because of the fast moving nature
right.
of those environments. Now,
Yeah.
if you can, just name a couple more of those places because, but you had one unique experience that you know I said that this can't prepare you more for international higher ed, and that was in Afghanistan. Is that correct, or was it?
That that
Yes.
is true.
Okay.
So fast forward, I went from the UAE, I repatriated to the United States, and then I have to tell the Afghanistan story from the beginning. So I actually applied for that position, got accepted, got the offer, and then there was an incident in Kabul, Afghanistan, and I looked at myself and I said, "What are you doing? You're going into a war zone," and I declined the position.
Mhm.
Um, Took a job in Nebraska. And I could have sat in that position. And I'm sure if anyone from Nebraska listening to this, they know exactly what school and what opportunity. But it was a dean's position. So I'd become the dean of a small school in the middle of Nebraska, dean of student affairs. And
Wow.
I could have sat there. And then a year later, fast forward a year from taking that position, the position of Afghanistan came open again. And I wrote them and said, I applied a year ago. Is it this when you interview me again? And they wrote me and said, tell us why you're gonna come this time. I said, I'm gonna come. And I did. I packed up my bags and left in 2012 and went to Kabul, Afghanistan to what is now the closed campus of the American University of Afghanistan. And if many people have been reading the news, what happened in Afghanistan earlier this year, that's why the university is closed. And the university is in the process of relocating itself to another country in the Middle East and trying to set up new operations. But I went to, yes, a war zone to educate men and women in a what was deemed a bad thing, a
Hmm.
co-ed
Hmm.
institution, um, educated, and I was student affairs, but I was academic advising, teaching first year experience. So again, here you go. I'm teaching liberal arts principles in the middle of a war zone. Um, and so that's Kabul, Afghanistan. And
Wow.
I left there and went to Dominica in the Caribbean, from Dominica to Singapore, and took a sabbatical and did Malaysia and Indonesia during my sabbatical. Headed on over to Bangladesh and COVID hit me there. Left Bangladesh in the middle of the pandemic and moved to Niger, West Africa, and left West Africa to now where I am. And on my second career sabbatical, and both my career sabbaticals are to really build my company.
Wow!
So there's the journey.
Yeah, it's an unbelievable journey, and it uniquely have prepared you for the work and your interests that you do now, and that is really looking at higher ed institutions that in developing countries that need or are in the process of trying to innovate. Now, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, or should I say innovate or change or transform into the needs of the kind of the new global economy. One of the things that you mentioned earlier was these areas like Center for Entrepreneurship and innovation hubs and all of these ideas and these emerging practices that are finding themselves in universities and just in hubs around the world. What are you seeing out there that's bringing your interest, but also that excites you about what's possible for these emerging universities in developing countries?
Sure. I think the foundation that excites me is that there's a mandate. The mandate is called United Nations Sustainability Goals. There's 17 of them. Number 4 is education. 4.3 is higher education. And it's all about equity in higher education. So providing equal access. And that means everywhere for everyone. And so I got into the sustainability goals and learned about them a few years ago, not very long, maybe 4-5 years ago at max. And that has driven some of what I do and why I'm doing what I'm trying to do with consulting and being at startup institutions and supporting workforce development skills and entrepreneurship type services. And I may not be in the entrepreneurship space per se, but I spend time helping students build the leadership skills, the group dynamics, the budgeting, the
Absolutely.
personal branding, all those pieces that they need to go be an innovator, an entrepreneur. So I help, and I see my goal is to help them develop those kinds of sets. And then help them connect to where I can, with the right people for the projects that they're seeking. Experiential learning is so big, and that
Absolutely.
is a big part of what we need in the entrepreneurship space. My personal and professional opinion, your entrepreneurship space in emerging countries really need to solve your country's issues.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, it's what is your resource and how are you going to use it to solve your country's issues, and then maybe those around you. I'm going to pick on Niger for a minute because that's the last place I was. It's the middle of the Sahara Desert. What is it? What is in the Sahara Desert? Nothing but heat and sunshine. Setting up something in a solar space is the innovation that is probably needed, whether that's for energy, whether that's for pumping water for irrigation from the river, whatever it may be. And that was one of the things that I had one of our students who saw that as an innovative area, did his capstone on it. Oh, and wow. By listening to him one evening as we were walking, then I met someone who was newly to the country from the US. And I said, oh, I need to connect this student and this person who's a teacher researcher. and so that he can fast forward his project. He can fast forward the development that he's doing to try to help his country. And so those are the types of things we need to be doing. In addition to teaching, researching within the local context, we need to be the connectors for the students in those countries. And I think that's important.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Currently, right now, most universities or colleges in general are rethinking how their students can and their learners can have a different learning experience that is not simply about, taking a unit course, but really cultivating, their talents through more experiential means that you mentioned. And I think Niger is a great example of a country that has, that is surrounded by what they're surrounded by, and how universities can serve as a hub of driving ideas and really launching ideas and different entrepreneurial projects. How do you think those education leaders respond to ideas like this, and how can we close the gap between the challenges and the opportunities?
I think that's a big part of the struggle. And I think the folks who are being innovative in those innovative universities, whether startups or transformation within existing organizations, are the leaders. I think it's not them.
Yeah.
I think it's their systems.
Yeah.
So you may have had a education system in the country for years, for centuries, that was implemented by, in most cases, your former colonizing country. And so those practices have been trickling down for years. This is how we do it. So when you have a new person, the new kid on the block, so to speak, that's challenging the norm, whether it's within their national university trying to innovate, or it's a startup private that's trying to innovate, it becomes a challenge. And typically it's a bigger challenge to the status quo when it's a private university that comes on the scene that tries to do this, and not one of the local public universities that says, oh, we're thinking differently.
What's the type of pushback that they usually get under those circumstances? The new venture education companies that are coming on board and want to do something differently. What are they running into as a buzzsaw?
Yeah. So I would say the things that I have noticed or read about are funding, accreditation, support for their curriculum. So they may have accreditation, their local accreditation, but that doesn't mean that the curriculum gets supported. Or the other piece is the on-the-ground experience. So you have to go to the families. The families may not think that, no, I don't want my daughter going into that or my son going to that. What is the cyber security stuff? Is that going to get them a real job? No. In emerging countries, real jobs are doctors, lawyers, the medical field, the engineering field, the finance, banking fields. That's what is known. Those are the traditional core educational platforms that lead to jobs. It's not, what's this new computer stuff that's coming up? And so one of the things that they have to do is to get to parents and demonstrate how is this the future, so that, because that is part of the pushback. So you may get pushback from the leadership of, the ministry, for example, but you also get pushback from the parents. I'm not going to risk my money that I've been saving for 10 years to send my son or daughter to this new program that I don't know anything about. They need to go to engineering school and become an engineer.
That is so common. And I think that's what often leads to education and higher ed really being set up as an elite endeavor, and really just an elite endeavor, and how there is a misalignment between economic growth opportunities and
Mhm.
talent. And that's one of the challenges and the opportunities in Africa. Now, we do have these ventures that are emerging in Africa, whether it's kind of your boot camps and accelerators to actual universities that are coming online, like is it African Leadership University, I believe?
Mhm.
Um,
ALU, yes.
ALU, which is a very unique company because it's a university because its founders have spent time working for corporate America and kind of global management consulting firms. So they really bring this body of knowledge around the connection between talent and emerging growth opportunities. What are you seeing on the ground in Africa? What are you researching right now that that has some promise to it, and why we should be interested in seeing Africa in the future in the higher ed space?
Okay. I think two things, Africa and Asia. And I'm going to be specific, Southeast Asia,
Yes.
for two reasons. Let's
Mhm.
start with numbers. Whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, both these regions have the youngest populations under the age of 30. So that's the first piece. Where education is going to bloom and blossom is in that under 30 population. And that those are the two spaces that have them. So when you take that, innovate that into the types of education. So there's a traditional university. We still will need doctors, lawyers, and engineers. I'm not saying we should get rid of them, but we need folks who are also going to be in the more vocational, skilled area. I need someone to be able to, once these, solar fields are hooked up, I need someone to be able to string all the wire in and the infrastructure that
Yeah.
goes to the power grid across 2-3 countries. Where do we have that? Where are we training that? Who are we training to do that? And I think those are the pieces we cannot miss out on. And I look at that space to be in that maybe 2-year to what we would call in the US a community college of
Sure.
vocational
Sure.
education space, a certification space that I think can greatly grow. We're becoming more digital. So where do we connect those spaces? Cybersecurity, 3D printing, all of these pieces
Absolutely.
to this new space of development in these countries. I think there is a need, and I don't necessarily know that some countries, I would say in Southeast Asia, are looking at that. I would say a handful of countries or institutions, organizations on the continent are looking at that. South America is also another place. We need not to forget South America in that space and in this conversation. But I think those are the things that we need to be on the lookout for. We need to develop. Not everyone needs to go to a 4-year institution and do all that. But if you're sending someone to a 2-year institution, make sure that at least a few months, let's just say a quarter, is spent on some of these leadership experiential learning
Absolutely.
development skills that you would get in that 4-year general ed scenario, because they need that. Group dynamics are group dynamics. Leadership development is leadership development. Running a student organization is a very valuable skill.
Absolutely.
And so those pieces need to happen, whether you're in a 4-year program, a 6-year program in med, or you're in a 2-year program learning a specific skill set. There are the trades are lacking globally, and we keep not acknowledging that.
No, absolutely. I think That is a wonderful point, mainly because even here in the United States, where we have community colleges who have done a great job in the past of educating and developing a generation of skilled, for a skilled workforce. But even today in the United States, we still have a stigma which is going away around community colleges versus the university, where parents will not recommend community colleges as a first option, even when they know that their kids may benefit from going to a 2-year, because there's such a social signal when it comes to 4-year institutions.
Right.
And so I agree with you. Yeah, excuse me, go for it.
No, I was going to say I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I'm actually in the process of writing a piece about that for the global market, because it's not just the US that has the stigma, it's a global stigma about
Absolutely.
2-year institutions. And we need to break that stigma, because it's those two potential 2-year programs, whether it's coding, whether it's apprenticeship, whatever it may be, that is actually going to build and continue to build the infrastructure and growth of our globe. to put that in context. And so I, in the midst of writing an article about this and why it's a key aspect for ministries in emerging countries, why it's a key aspect that should be integrated into the educational structure and framework globally. Whether that is a 2-year program in tourism for countries that tourism is a key sector, and folks are just learning, but they're not being they're not getting that development.
Sure.
In some places they are, but again, whether that is an agro-based 2-year program, so that it's homegrown agro-based, and not that I go to Germany to learn how to plant wheat. Well, when you come back to planting wheat in South Africa, the climate's different and the earth is different. And so why not create those programs that are locally based and have a quicker turnaround for families? Because part of this is about sustainability for the family. These are much communal cultures where 1 or 2 family members may be the ones that go off to college, and they turn around and support their family, sometimes the whole villages, based on their degrees and education. And so why not make that more cost effective, and the ROI is returns quicker.
Absolutely. Well, it's, right now in the international space, just really globally right now, we're finding and we're seeing that even though we're constantly always talking about the upheavals of the world, but there truly is kind of a global economic shift that's occurring, where the ideal of your country having opportunities with digitalization to really kind of change the narrative of your country and the outcomes for its citizens is a tremendous time. And a lot of that is centered around infrastructure. It's centered around both digital and global and physical infrastructure, and the need for trained people in this area is tremendous. So it's really good to hear that you're seeing this emerge as an issue, so much that you're writing this article, which, by the way, EdVenture would definitely welcome that article. But one last thing I want to mention about this is that, yes, there is on the parent side, but also I think on the polytechnic, which I know they often use that term internationally, but in the community college and polytechnic side, there's also some growth that needs to take place because of how these education programs are sold, but also the lack of capacity. The capacity right now doesn't necessarily align with the need, with the growth need, for these individuals. So there's a gap there on both parts
Mm-hmm.
that need to really be harnessed right now globally. So anyhow,
Yep.
I'm sorry, that was more of a statement than a
No worries. I'm nodding in agreement. Nodding in agreement.
that's more of a statement than a question here. So I want to stay on Africa for a bit. You talked a little bit about experiential learning, and that's fast becoming an area that is seen as a way of developing those not only those soft skills, which would some call, but also I would say those technical skills as well. Where do you find the challenge with experiential learning, especially in the traditional universities? Because so often, we're all still working on the Carnegie Hour, which really makes that 3-unit course a standalone, and so often can't necessarily put together experiential learning the way it may need to be experienced in the field. How are you seeing developing countries who are usually traditional embrace experiential learning, or how can we sell it more?
I don't necessarily know that I've seen a clear-cut model yet.
Mm-hmm.
What I've seen or I've tried to piece together is pieces that matter. So, for example, when I got to, and again, I'm going to use Niger, but I'll also talk a little bit about other things that I think are important. So when I got to Niger, the institution I was at, they had the speaker series. They did some workshops with their students, and they encourage their students to enter and engage into entrepreneurship and to go out into the community. From my perspective, we need to formalize that. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I've been working on creating what's called a career development or a career development series and program model, where you have workshops that are teaching you concepts or skills. You bring in a speaker that then speaks to that concept or skill or something around that to, again, reinforce what was already done. And then they head out into a project that centers around that as well.
Yeah.
Again, it's a model that also fits into the sustainability goals. Mm-hmm. For example, if you're teaching something on, let's say, workshop around recycling and environment, you bring in someone who talks about the importance of that. And continues that conversation. And then your experiential learning piece is, okay, let's go out and create a tree planting scenario, or mm-hmm. let's take plastic bottles, for example, cut them in half, pot them with soil, and let's create an herb garden.
Sure.
Again, I've taught you about recycling and how we can do that. We've had someone who come in and engage you in a conversation about how they've done it and their story. And then now we're going to go out and do it. So we make it part of the intentional co-curricular program that we're teaching you how to go from workshop to motivation and be motivated to then putting it into practice in the local community. And again, you're serving the community as part of these projects.
I love it.
So that's kind of what a conceptualized concept based on just what I've experienced in particularly Bangladesh and Niger. Two very emerging countries at different levels trying to do this differently.
So you mentioned the UN, and it sounds like that you've really have taken kind of a deep dive into some of their initiatives. So we know that the UN kind of puts these global goals out. But what is that supported by? I mean, you could put out a global goal, but what gives these developing countries, the universities there, what is the incentive to be different other than a report by the UN? So what's actually happening on the ground that may support that through funding or some opportunities for enterprise to play a role in that development?
Well, I think it's important. I think what I've been reading mostly, and I've seen a little bit of is quite a bit of foundations. So whether that be scholarships out of like our U.S. Embassy for students in those in emerging countries, youth development scholarships, things of this nature. Whether that be some of the larger foundations coming in and supporting these emerging and developing institutions with their curriculum and their move towards a hybrid or a digital platform for their institution so their students can have better access. And so there's some big foundations out there that are trying to support or universities, organizations, academic organizations with that. You also have what I call the non-governmental space, so the NGO space that embrace the students who are coming out of some of these spaces. To be able to get that experience as well. I think in emerging countries, you do find a lot of NGOs. And so those NGOs
A
often want to
lot.
have, right. And many of them would love to have local folks as part of their organizations that really understand the context to be able to implement programs in the country. And I think that's where our students at these institutions, venture institutions, startups that are being more student-centered, student-focused, entrepreneurship driven, innovative, can actually connect. Because I think some of these projects that are coming, whether it be some of the large NGOs from globally, or whether it be some of the UN's divisions,
Sure.
because the UN has a lot of them, that will match. I think because the sustainability goals, they've been out there for a while.
Yeah.
We're literally we're literally halfway through to 2030, which is when they're supposed to be realized, and we're not there. And I think there is now a sustainable push that's happening from organizations, from foundations, from key higher ed organizations globally to make this a reality to the best way we can. I think we're behind the 8 ball. That's just my personal opinion because we didn't do this sooner.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the reasons why. I mean, I've known about sustainability goals, but I didn't know anyone who was doing them or looking at them. And it's just recently that I've been able to get into that. And so I'm focusing on mine, which is number 4.
Yeah, that's great.
But what I say to people, this is what's fascinating, at least my perspective, is that there's 17. Number 17 is partnerships and relationships, essentially. So there's 16 others, number 4 being one of the other 16. But philosophically, at least from my perspective, you can't manage gender equity or zero poverty or climate change or sustainability. You can't manage the other 15 without 4, which is education. Because you've got to give, develop, embrace knowledge in order to take care of the other sustainability goals.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And it's always presented as the chicken or the egg type of scenario. A lot of these countries also need to design economic growth.
Right.
outside of the NGO model, I think that oftentimes can slow down progress because of those countries being the developing country, or excuse me, the advanced countries being donors, or what they're called donor nations to some of the developing countries. And sometimes that can slow down economic growth, where education really can align with opportunity.
Right.
So one last question here, well, maybe two.
Okay.
So you had mentioned a couple of times around globally professional opportunities. I think I heard you mention diversity a couple of times. And I heard you on other podcasts kind of speak to your interest in bringing, more diverse, diverse, more inclusive groups into the international higher ed space. Why is that high on your list, or at least a priority on your list? And how can that be addressed as a challenge?
Okay. I think one of the things about the emerging countries that we often go to is they need to see representation. Um, and it's not always going to look like them, but close enough.
Sure.
And so so that's one piece. Two, I also think that the skill sets that many of us in the diaspora, and I'm going to use the global diaspora of folks who are of color, can bring to each other is vast and diverse. And so whether you are from India going to Chile, or whether you are from the US going to Fiji, whether you are from Switzerland going to, Rwanda, if you're within the diaspora of color and you're bringing that knowledge, and then you're also choosing to learn the context, I think you can make a significant impact. I also think reverse brain drain needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know most people don't like that terminology, brain drain, but many countries have deliberately and intentionally sent their best and brightest abroad to get degrees, and then they never return for whatever plethora of reasons. Now, they may do things like remittance and send money back home to the infrastructure, to their families, but they never come back in some case to be hands on the ground. Now, some of that has to do with infrastructure, which we talked about. But I do think that if we're able to bring some of those folks back home, I think it would make a difference. And I think if we're able to bring folks who look like me, that, my reverse brain drain would be back to Jamaica, or from a generational perspective, because I'm not Jamaican born. But I think when you start to do things like that, whether it's the next generation, the current generation that left, helping to boost that, I think makes a difference. And I would say the place I saw that a little bit was in Bangladesh, the university that I worked at there. I saw a few people who had returned from the US and the UK back to a private university there to help build and boost that institution. And that institution is making a significant difference in the country. And then pushing the education system there, and doing so in ways that I don't think any of the local national universities are doing. So I think those are some of the things, and I think that's why it's important to me to see us go back and do. And us could be your originally family-wise from that country or that region, or us being the global us going back and saying, you know what, I'm going to put my efforts here.
Right.
And here could be anywhere. Here for me could be Sri Lanka. Here for me could be South Africa. it's wherever here is. And I think that's one of the reasons why when I do the expat coaching, I try to open people's mind beyond their initial list.
Sure. That's fantastic. So, Karla, I know that you do a lot of writing as a way of gathering your own kind of thought leadership and really spreading that into the world. So, and you mentioned that you're writing something on community colleges or 2 years as a global opportunity. So just real briefly, so what's next for what is Karla thinking about around these topics now that we can look for in the future?
Oh, I think well, one, I'm going to hit it's August and September, so I'm going to do a piece coming out about kind of the transition of college students in general. It will be have a more North American slant because but the fact that college students have this transition, it's a universal transition when you go from high school to the college university setting, and that parents need not to worry. It's normal, it's natural. There's actually theory behind it. I'm actually throwing in author Chick Corinne's 7 vectors in there to explain it. I could have used a couple others, but I thought that one, a couple of the vectors are key in that. So that's a piece that's coming up. The 2-year proposition for, emerging economies and nations is another piece. I think long term, I'm also going to try to look at, how we can do experiential learning. So there's a proposal that I've written. So this concept and model, I'm hoping to write a short paper around the model that I'm proposing to colleges and university. I think another space that I'm fascinated in, and partly because I'm doing a consultancy in this space right now, is study abroad. And it's coming from a different angle. Students from the US in particular, roughly 30 to 40,000 students may leave the US over the course of an academic year to go and study abroad. And how can they, instead of just taking a course, become part of the economy that they're in? Part of how do they become part of the sustainability goals that need to happen in the countries they're going to? Many of them are going to more established countries, but there's a chunk enough that's going to emerging countries, or countries that are just emerged and still trying to tear up. And so how can they, as study abroad students who've gotten this wealth of education, let's say from the US in this case, become part of the educational experience on the ground to develop another nation, instead of just going there for their education and just partying. No, let's just be honest, partying too.
No, I actually that's a very good one. So EdVenture, we just interviewed Devin Walker at the University of Texas, who actually runs their global program that does exactly that. He doesn't, to your point, so often, we have study abroad where students will go to, develop and perhaps even non-developed countries. But when they go there, it's, their projects are, I'm trying to find the best way to say this, but it's, to me, it has kind of this, this advanced versus non-advanced country relationship. Let's go build a well type of stuff, and you have these countries that are trying to develop their economies and could use for us to kind of join the team, to bring entrepreneurial skills and capacity, and you'll see very soon that Devin Walker, who's actually taken on more responsibility at the University of Texas, but he's been running programs like this, mainly for students of color, where they're learning entrepreneurship, and then they're going to countries, whether it's China, whether it's in Africa, and some of the other countries, to deploy themselves to do that type of work, to do exactly what you just mentioned earlier in this interview, to help solve problems, like
Right.
big, audacious, complex challenges, which is needed to be addressed in order for these economies to have opportunities to grow. So,
Right.
yeah. So I'm really looking forward to some of the ideas that are emerging with you. Once again, I'm looking forward to the partnership. And I want to thank you for coming on and just sharing a wealth of information, not only from your own experience, but from that body of knowledge that that you are sharing with the world, and helping construct some new ideas around how we can make higher ed more like a venture, taking on big challenges. So I want to thank you, Karla.
Well, thank you, Ahmed. Thank you so much. It was my pleasure to share. And I think, you and I are, to use the word, the common term, unicorns
Absolutely.
in this
Absolutely.
space right now. But we don't have to be. We literally can bring other folks along. I think it's a matter of helping them understand the concepts, the needs, and where they can fit, short term or long term. It doesn't have to be long term. You don't have to do a 10-year like Karla. You can do a 3 month. You can do a sabbatical. You can do a visiting professor. There are ways you can make impact in a shorter space, in a shorter time span, as well as if you choose to do the long term, great. Just make sure it's sustainable.
Absolutely. Thank you. This has been fantastic.
Great.